activities, events. And I will ask that those with questions just use the little hand raise sign on your Zoom, and we will try to accommodate you as best as we can. I will proceed, and I will ask Mr. Hyacinth to open up with some remarks.
Thank you, Mr. Gibson. I'm pleased to welcome everyone to the first installment of Independence Dialogue Tuesdays, organized by the Consulate General of St. Lucia in New York, under the theme, A Time for Reflection on National Gains and Challenges and Their Way Forward. Our goal is to engage, foster consciousness and awareness of our fellow St. Lucians, both at home and abroad. As such, we have gathered an impressive lineup of speakers who will, over the next 4 weeks, address a range of timely and important issues. We at the Consulate would like to express our heartfelt thanks and appreciation to our featured speaker this evening, Dr. Tennyson Joseph. Dr. Joseph will address us on the topic, St. Lucia's Socioeconomic Transformation Post-Independence. We believe that given Dr. Joseph's prominence and professional journey, that his views on tonight's topic would be of tremendous interest to our audience. Thank you, Dr. Joseph, for lending us your expertise on the topic, St. Lucia's Socioeconomic Transformation Post-Independence. I want to thank you all for taking time to join us this evening. Thank you, Dane.
All right, thank you, Mr. Hassan. Okay, I believe we have the ambassador, H.E. Julian Dubois, St. Lucia's ambassador to the diaspora, who will present some remarks.
Okay.
Ambassador Dubois, you muted.
Okay, thanks much, Mr. Gibson. And I wish to recognize Consul General Jeremiah Hyacinth, Consul General Henry Mongal, Consul General Darrell Monthrop, our esteemed guest speaker this evening, Dr. Tennyson Joseph, a dear colleague. My brothers and sisters throughout the diaspora, I bid you a pleasant good evening. And I want to sincerely welcome you to this forum, this very educational undertaking. On behalf of the minister who was supposed to be with us, he asked that I express his sincere apologies, having been in another engagement with the cabinet that he could not leave at this time, but he certainly join us later in the evening if time permits. Okay. I really want to congratulate the Consulate General of New York with the support of Ambassador Menisa Rambali for undertaking this great initiative. You know, the Office of Diaspora Affairs always stands prepared to support these initiatives as it falls in line with what we're endeavoring to do and successfully pursue. We at the Diaspora Affairs Office also pursue or undertake the virtual diaspora engagements quarterly, and it's to expose our nationals to some of the undertakings by our government, by our country, because our vision is that our nationals, regardless of where they reside, would be so informed, so connected, so kept abreast of what's happening at home, that they'd feel as involved in our decision-making, in our development activities, if they so desire, as if they were at home, or as our nationals who are resident at home. And this event this evening is in pursuit of this very goal. Okay? I must say it is quite rewarding to know that we have the resources right among us, the likes of Dr. Tennyson Joseph, who every time we call upon is always available and ready to provide us support. So with this Indeed, I would like to thank everyone for joining us. I'm hoping that we continue to celebrate our 44th anniversary of independence with great glory and great aplomb. And I would like to continue thanking our Consulate General in New York for this undertaking. So here's to a great event, and thanks once again, my brothers and sisters. Good evening.
Thank you, Ambassador Dubois. I am now going to introduce Daryl Montrop, the newly installed Consulate General of St. Lucia in Miami, to introduce the guest speaker. Mr. Montrop.
Thank you, Dean. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, wherever you may be rooming or settled. I have been assigned the simplest but most prideful task of introducing my friend and comrade to present this evening's lecture. This lecture is taking place as part of our own necessary reflection on the independence experience. As we seek to celebrate and mark the 44th anniversary of St. Lucia's independence, under the theme Devant un Somme, one people shaping our destiny, it is imperative that we cast a critical eye on what that journey has meant. Devant un Somme, or Forward Together, suggests a shared hope of progress. Whilst our opinion and views are heterogeneous or varied, we are fairly homogeneous as a people. This homogeneity allows us to unite under one flag as one people. Yet, there remains the tension over the direction of our thought. How can we shape a destiny of shared prosperity, particularly given our history, where the value of our productive endeavors was not utilized for our common good? One person who can certainly address this tension is tonight's presenter, Dr. Tennyson Joseph. Tennyson, muscles from destiny. Many of he is affectionately known as, is a lecturer at the University. I say lecturer, not to diminish his standing in the university, but to accentuate his role in shaping regional mind as a teacher in the purest sense of the word. Many college and university professors routinely communicate their ideas to colleagues in their field, and they publish papers at conferences. Many, unless they pursue interdisciplinary work, really share ideas with colleagues in other fields. They engage with the general public or policymakers even less frequently. And when they do, they sometimes fail to translate their research into language that is understood by the audiences that lack familiarity with the discipline. As such, academics have been justly criticized for their inability to make their research on critical topics understandable to lay audiences. The lack of interaction between academics and the public causes important research to be obscured in translation. It encourages public skepticism and intensifies negative perceptions of higher education. Dr. Joseph, as the consummate public intellectual, does not suffer those ailments. His scholarship is not merely theoretical, but grounded in his life experience. There's a cultural critic by the name of Arthur Melzer who states that the defining feature of the public intellectual is a tension between theory and practice, contemplation and action. He says that the public intellectual is a knower of ideas and partakes in the public sphere. Public intellectuals are known to disturb the peace, as they often challenge the status quo and the ways of seeing and doing. Tonight, expect Dr. Joseph to disturb you as he addresses St. Lucia's socio-economic transformation post-independence. With expectations raised by advocates of independence, the pre-independence period, the challenge of meeting public demands can turn into political crisis for a new entity and can devolve into scapegoating of political opponents. Of course, things can quickly spiral downward from there. Was or is this our story? We need a clear-eyed assessment of the past 44 years, and Dr. Joseph is going to help do that. For those who don't know him, Tennyson Joseph was born in 2007 and undertook his secondary education at the College. He attained his PhD from the University of Cambridge and his MPhil and BA from UWI Cambridge. His MPhil was written on the political course of LRJ, and his PhD in politics on the politics of decolonization and globalization in St. Lucia. He has been a lecturer in political science at the UWI Cambridge since 1987. Of course, prior to lecturing, Tennyson served as administrative assistant to Prime Minister Kenya between 2000 and 2003, and served in the Senate of St. Lucia during 2000, at least between 2006 and 2007. Of course, in addition to teaching, Tennyson is constantly engaged as a public intellectual and consultant. He's a weekly columnist in the Daily Nation newspaper, and he has served in various capacities on regional task force. Yeah. His research areas include Caribbean political philosophy, CLR James thought, political thought, the political thought of Athens. Of course, he studied Caribbean politics and St. Lucia's politics and post-1945. As Tennyson would describe, or would say that he is deeply committed to the idea of an engaged intellect, particularly in a resourceful region like the Caribbean, in which significant amount of public resources have been spent on public education to correct the historical legacies of the underfunding and limited for learning. As a disciple of the idea of engaged organic intellect, Dr. Joseph has unhesitatingly offered his views on public affairs in various media houses throughout the Caribbean. Ladies and gentlemen, sons and daughters of St. Lucia, I present to you my friend and comrade, a true patriot, Dr. Tennyson Joseph.
Okay, thank you, colleagues. Thank you, comrade Montroub, for those very inspiring words, though a bit dimmed and muted, but I could hear the sincerity in your voice, and I appreciate the sentiments expressed. Let me first of all give my congratulations and show my deep respect to the St. Lucia Consulate in New York, in particular the Consulate General Jeremiah Hyacinth, for organizing this very important activity. I think one of the things that we have always suffered from historically is the way in which we have not yet devised proper mechanisms for including our diaspora and our overseas resources into the national development efforts. And I think what we are witnessing tonight and what I can sense has been happening in recent times is a concerted attempt to bring our diaspora more into the mainstream development of our societies, particularly since we are not enough resource population-wise, and also because the diaspora constitutes some of the most obviously globally exposed people. We have among the most educated section of our population, and our most skilled personnel, more of them living outside than inside. So we cannot afford the luxury of not including our diaspora in our central in our national development efforts. So I suspect as the years go by, this will become more and more a central part of what we do as small island developing nations. Let me thank, of course, all the other consulate generals who are here with us tonight, in particular my friend Darrell Montroub and my comrade Julian Dubois, my respected friend Melissa Rambali, and the other colleagues who Mr. Henry Mangal, who I think is with us, and all the other friends and colleagues. Let me also say good night to the class of 85. I'm sorry for doing so, but I have to do it. The St. Mary's College class of 85, who I think through our WhatsApp chat, we have been making a special effort to keep our ties together. And these are very important ties. And I know many of the colleagues and brothers are actually part of the diaspora too, living in Canada, North America. I want to say a special good night to them. On our WhatsApp chat, I promised them that we wanted to do some Ruru together tonight. I don't think it is possible for me to do it by myself. I think I want to invite the colleagues to share in what I'm trying to do, so we can, as Darius says, we can disturb, in the words of Bob Marley, disturb our neighbors a bit from what we have to say tonight. I want to say, first of all, colleagues, that I do not want this to be a lecture. I honestly don't want this to be a formal lecture. I really want it to be a dialogue in the spirit of the Dialogue Tuesday nomenclature that you have given to this activity, but also because I think the kind of activity I want to have and the kind of forum we're having now is not one in which I want to sit and give a kind of stiff and formal lecture, but I want to have a conversation about the topic before us. So I have decided not to present, and I hope the chair can forgive me for that, not to present a formal lecture. I have prepared a few speaking notes, and those notes are only to keep me on track to my themes. I want to make this a conversation, not a lecture. And I also do not want it to be a monologue. So, Mr. Chair, what I plan to do, with your indulgence, is to speak for about 30 minutes, basically to present what I call the central thesis of my talk tonight. And I think by the time my 30 minutes of speaking is over, I would have said basically the key things that I would have wanted to say. So after 30 minutes, I may continue talking if there are one or two things I think that are left unsaid. But I think after 30 minutes, the interventions from our group, our chat group right now can start coming, and we can have a dialogue, and hopefully I will basically indicate when I think I have finished my formal presentation, and then we can have the formal back and forth discussion. I want to apologize, Mr. Chair, if that violates the principle or the procedure that you had assumed that you would pursue, but I also want to indicate that I really do want this to be a dialogue and not a formal lecture. And so I'd be very appreciative if we approach it in this manner that I have put forward there tonight. So basically, I want to do about 3 things in my talk tonight. So I have been tasked to speak on St. Lucia's socio-economic transformation since independence. So I want to develop my thesis, which is to make a connection between socio-economic transformation and in particular social transformation. And I know why, and I will indicate why I'm stressing social transformation and independence. So there is a link I am going to assert between social transformation and this instrumentality of sovereign power, which we call independence, which allows for social transformation. So in doing so, I will be seeking to show that the essence of independence relies primarily on space that it allows the sovereign state. It allows you a space called sovereign statehood, which essentially gives you the capacity to engage in social transformation. And built into that thesis is also the view that the colonial state was not designed for social transformation. So I'll be comparing and contrasting the colonial state against the post-colonial state. And I've been making the point that it is this thing which we call social transformation, which should be, in theory, the main dividing line between a colonial state and a post-colonial state. The colonial state, I will argue, is concerned with other things. Of course, the colonial state is concerned with, in my argument, 2 basic things. It is concerned with basically a kind of what, let's call it a coercive apparatus, in other words, military and other forms of social control to keep domestic populations in check, because it is actually a colonial relationship, and an extractive apparatus to siphon wealth from the colony to the metropole. Once a colonial state achieves those 2 basic things, then the colonial state has achieved its objective. So by extension, a post-colonial state, an independent state, has to be something more than just the question of social control and extracting resources from the colony to the metropole. And that is where I think the discussion I want to take it should go. So I'm saying essentially that when we look at St. Lucia's independence, once I have established the differences between the colonial state and the post-colonial state, what I want to do is to explore briefly the anti-colonial and post-colonial history of St. Lucia, showing how the main differences between the two main contending political parties over time, the differences have revolved largely around the question of the extent to which the post-colonial state can or should engage in post-colonial social transformation. I want to make a point very early. All of the post-colonial governments of St. Lucia have been interested in post-colonial social transformation. But the main differences between those governments exist or lie on the question of how far one can go. So there is always an economic overarching question which shapes or limits or underpins this question of social transformation. And that is what I think the main dividing line between all of our political administrations have been. And you can split them however you want, and you can examine them by personality and leaders, or you can examine them over time. But I've just given you what, in my view, and I hope we can have differences of opinion on that, would have been the main contours that separate one political party from another, one particular leader from another. So to put it to you in stark terms, there are those that focus largely on the economic questions. So there are those that focus largely on keeping what the language we hear is getting the economic fundamentals right, ensuring that you have balanced income and revenue and so forth, that the state does not overextend itself. That is one view, and that view is always linked to a broader global environment, which we will also take into consideration in our conversation tonight. And that is contrasted against those who start, and I must admit from where I sit, from the perspective that post-colonial transformation has to do with social transformation. And therefore, what distinguishes a post-colonial state from a colonial state is the extent to which that post-colonial state starts from the perspective that local populations, their lives, the quality of life have to be transformed from what existed under colonialism. So very often those who hold the economic fundamentals question, when you open and expose the policy framework, when you lay them bare, there basically is no fundamental difference to what a colonial state would have done and to what that other orientation allows you to do. So just to give you another a clearer example of what I'm trying to say, questions like the development of a local entrepreneurial class, and by local I mean a national bourgeoisie. That can be an important question that a post-colonial state takes into consideration, that a colonial state is not interested in developing a local bourgeoisie or a local entrepreneurial class. The colonial state is only ensuring, as I said to you before, siphoning resources from a colonial state to the metropole. And therefore, a post-colonial state might say, well, you know something, let us reserve certain areas for local economic activities and so forth. And those questions are always there. But very often what you find, those entities or those groups or those individuals or those classes who focus on the economic side often do so on the basis that, yes, we are going to come to the social side, but we have to get the economics right. And that, I think, is one of the fundamental contradictions I want us to work through tonight. That contradiction between economic stability and growth and social transformation. I think the two things are at loggerheads. In my conclusion tonight, I want to make some policy prescriptions to suggest how we can, in fact, overcome this contradiction and make the two, join the two. And I will make some suggestions as to how in the 21st century, in the present moment, we can do that. So I hope we are still here with what I'm going through. So basically, the second task I will do is to spend some time looking at the post-colonial history of St. Lucia, showing how the main differences between the two, is very often there were two main contending parties, revolved around the question of the extent to which post-colonial transformation should take place, and the balance is to be placed on economic fundamentals, however defined. And also linked to that, how much deliberate spending one can do on social measures to transform the lives of the majority population. That doesn't mean that there were not other considerations in this question of independence. Another important consideration in this question of independence was the question of the foreign policy. Because if you think of the colonial state, one of the key differences between the colonial state and the post-colonial state is that under the colonial state, you did not have the instrumentality of sovereignty in your hand. So your ability to have foreign relations and to engage in relations with other states was out of your hand. But once you achieved independence, that was also within your hand. And you can also see in there debates about to what extent you do foreign policy that frustrates what was perceived to be a government, or you do foreign policy, on the other hand, that enlarges your partners and widens your relations beyond those that existed under colonialism. So you can see what I'm saying there. It's a complex set of questions, a very complex set of questions that involve many things: the cultural transformation, the development of a local bourgeoisie, the widening of your foreign policy, the shifting of your economic relations. All of those are complex questions that go into this thing we call independence. But for tonight's purpose, we're trying to focus and narrow it down to the question of social transformation or socio-economic transformation. And hopefully, as the dialogues continue over the next few weeks, we can have more perspectives focusing on other themes. So that would be my second task. So the third thing I want to do will be to turn directly to the question of the social transformation of St. Lucia over the period. So, and since the Consulate General has given us the task of examining the question from St. Lucia's independence, I will focus on the question from 1979, which is when St. Lucia gained its independence. So I will be trying to explain, that will be the meat of the presentation in my view, where I'm trying to give you a brief history of St. Lucia's social transformation over various historic periods. So that's the title of my third section, a brief history of St. Lucia's social transformation. And I'll be looking at basically about 4 periods. The period of what I call the banana economy, and since it started from 1979. I know the banana economy began before 1979, but because our terms of reference is to deal with the questions of independence, I will be speaking of it from the banana economy from 1979 to 1990. And 1990 is what I call the rise of globalization. So we have an end point there. The second period through which I will examine St. Lucia's socio-economic transformation will be the period 1990 2008. And of course, you can see 2008 is the beginning of what was then referred to as the Second Great Depression. So notice I'm jumping from crisis to crisis. And it is within those jumps from crisis to crisis that we have something called a St. Lucia Independence Project that is trying to transform social lives. And because you have a broad overarching framework of global economic crisis, you can see why the debate between those who hold to issues of economic fundamentalism will matter because you have a global crisis, and those who hold an alternative view, which is to spend money on social transformation, would then be engaged in debate within the context of broad global economic crises. So that's my second period. And the third period I would call the period 2008 to the present. And the period 2008 to the present, we can think of it as a long crisis of global capitalism. So if I were to just throw out some markers there, indeed, we can even go back to the 911, 2008. Then you had more recently, the COVID crisis. Then it was a massive blow to anybody's economy globally. And then you had more recently, as we speak, the war in Ukraine. So this whole period, 2008 to the present, we will call the long crisis of global capitalism. And in that period too, I'll be making some very broad pronouncements about socio-economic transformation in St. Lucia, in keeping with my theme about what a post-colonial state can and cannot do. And finally, I want to close on a prescriptive note, because we are often accused of talking and describing. A lot of us do that very well. We can describe and we can analyze, but we are very, very weak when it comes to prescribing. So that, if with your indulgence, Chair Gibson, I want to conclude by offering some prescriptions. But I am speaking largely of a so-called contradiction between economic transformation and economic stability and economic growth and economic fundamentals on one hand, and what I call social transformation on the other. So in my last part, which is my conclusion, I will prescribe policy measures which in my view, bridge the gap between the two. So there is really no, in other words, we are going to try to resolve the contradiction, and there really is no contradiction, except if you just shift your lens a little, you can see that there is really no contradiction between social transformation, transforming the lives of the main human resources, which is the people, and economic growth and economic stability, and bringing in foreign exchange, and all of the other things that the so-called those who hold to economic fundamentals normally rely on. So I'll be making, with your indulgence, policy prescriptions. And after I do that, I can conclude, and hopefully we can have a little dialogue. The hotter it gets, the better and happier I will feel. The more you disagree with me, the happier indeed I will feel. So I come to my first part, which is to say something very quickly, because I only gave myself 30 minutes to talk, about colonialism, independence, and the question of social development. Now, before I go any further in saying anything about colonialism, independence, and the question of social development, I want to just say something. I hope there are young people listening, because I'm making this point for a very important reason. I did invite my students to come into this chat. I'm not sure if they did, but there are many young people in St. Lucia and outside who basically have a false view of what colonialism is. So I'm not sure if any of you follow these polls. Every year, I think, and I'm not speaking with hard and cold facts here. I'm giving you what I have picked up from my own reading, and I've seen it myself. There was a time when I used to follow every year the Jamaican independence, the glean out of the poll. And one of the questions obviously was, they would ask the public whether they think Jamaica's condition is better with independence or not. And very often, every year, the polls were saying we should have stayed under British colonialism. And very often, this is the young people who are saying so. So when I have this part of my talk where I'm talking about what colonialism is, the essence of colonialism versus the essence of an independent state, I want to direct that conversation to young people so that they would understand that a lot of the myths about the post-colonial state, the pre-colonial period and how things were better would be false. So that is really what I want to do. So what is the essence then between the colonial state and the post-colonial state? I was saying in my little introductory remarks, you can actually reduce the post-colonial state to two things. That is what a post-colonial state does. A colonial state, you can actually reduce a colonial state to two things. What does a colonial state do? In essence, a colonial state has two basic functions. To suppress the local population, that is why very often you see a strong military apparatus, very firm on police, on prisons. And of course, if you go back further, you will see that's why you have forts and you have guns pointing at the cities. So Castries and Vigi and Pigeon Point. Of course, there were wars, there were intercolonial wars, which made those things necessary. But there was also suppressing the domestic population. So the state is not meant for the development of people. The state is meant to suppress the majority population, and that suppression of the majority population occurs because the colonial state has an extractive function. So if you take something like public services, let's take what you call roads, bridges, infrastructure. The infrastructure of a colonial state is not meant for people. So when you build a road or bridge, like take the African states, for example, the railway lines run from the plantation producing the palm oil to the port. So the railway lines are there. So the colonial state invests in railway lines, but the railway lines were not meant to transport human beings. The railway lines were meant for goods. Okay? So the colonial state is not interested in human development. And so the colonial state doesn't build schools, it doesn't give you libraries, it doesn't give you hospitals, it doesn't give you all of the things that you now normally demand from a post-colonial state to make the lives of people better. So I have, in essence, summarized for you in very rough terms what the I don't know this beautiful song by Bob Marley, Crazy Ballhead. He said it very nicely. You built your penitentiary. You built penitentiary and when you built schools, it was not really for proper education and so forth. So Codrington College in Barbados was a school built for white planters' sons. And the reason why Barbados had Codrington College was because there was a local white resident population. But by and large, it is only after emancipation, 1846 in Trinidad and so forth, you begin to have basic amenities like schools. And by the way, they were not provided by the colonial state. They were provided by the church. So an NGO called the church, the Anglican Church or the Catholic Church, is providing schools. In many cases, the missionaries and so forth, the Methodist missionaries. So I make my point that the colonial state is not interested in social development. Now, if the colonial state is not interested in social development, if the essence of the colonial state is that it is not interested in social development, then the post-colonial state, one of its missions, I would say logical missions, is to do the things that the colonial state would not do. So the post-colonial state is no longer, or should in theory, no longer be concerned only with suppressing the local population and extracting resources. There are other questions that now become the business of the post-colonial state to take care of. The massive illiteracy, the very bad environmental conditions, the public health diseases. In St. Lucia growing up, remember bilharzia and those things, the slum clearance. So these are the things. In other words, you are now creating a state that looks after human beings and not just concerned with economic questions. So that is when the first president of Ghana, Kwame Nkrumah, was decolonizing, he made the famous comment, seek ye first the political and everything else shall be added on to you. The assumption was that once you had one instrumentality of independence, the political kingdom, then you could do all the other things would be added on to you, like magic. So I have the state, now I can have education, healthcare, and so forth. Of course, the reality was a bit different because having inherited the post-colonial state, many governments realized that, no, we still have the broad, in addition to having social responsibility for the mass of the population, where the money going to come from is a rough question. And that is why economic questions continue to be a key feature. So in many cases, you had a post-colonial situation in which the same economic relations, I'll be quite blunt, let's take St. Lucia and bananas. So what brought in foreign exchange was bananas. You had a relation with gifts. So there was nothing on the agenda that spoke about the radical transformation of the economy because of that question called economic fundamentalism. And in the case of let me bring it down directly to St. Lucia. So our first prime minister who went into independence, who brought us into independence, was Sir John. And Sir John was very aware of the question I'm talking about there in relation to economic limitations. And for that reason, he overtly couched a policy called what I would call limited sovereignty. If you read his independence speech, and I invite every young solution or old solution to read the independence speech. In fact, it's one of my, I do that for my little relaxation sometimes. I read the old independence speeches. So Compton is basically saying, in fact, he was repeating what Bustamante had said. We are in the West. St. Lucia cannot fly in the face of history, nor can we fly in the face of geography, and therefore our economic relations will continue to be the same. So essentially what you have is what I call in my book a nuanced or limited sovereignty. And that limited sovereignty was basically saying all of those big fancy things that you all think a post-colonial state can do, transform the lives of people, we don't have, not that I don't want to do them, but the economic questions were weighing more heavily. So it was a limited independence. So the first thing we're noting in relation to this question of social transformation is that in the earliest years of independence, it was compromised on the basis of this narrow articulation of what I call the sovereign possibilities of the post-colonial state. And there were questions about size. The question of size was an important question shaping independence. So again, in Sir John's case, he was talking about things like, basically when Sir John made his argument for independence, he made his argument for independence in one of his convention speeches to his party. And he said, and that I think encapsulates what I mean by limited sovereignty. Do you know when Sir John was making his argument for independence, what Sir John said? Sir John said, the next area of growth for St. Lucia is tourism. But I cannot go into tourism because I do not have the instrumentality called foreign affairs in my hand. I do not have the instrumentality of foreign affairs in my hand. Because with foreign affairs, I can now engage in aviation negotiations with all kinds of airlines from all around the world. So that is why I am going into independence. So all of the fancy talk that you will hear about Black power and breaking the colonial relationship and all of the other cultural and very important psychics of decolonization, that was not factored in the solution case because he was making an economic argument. And it was a valid economic argument. He used to complain, I can't even go to a CARICOM committee. Barbados and Jamaica, Guyana, and Trinidad and Tobago are having CARICOM meetings, and I have to go as an observer. He used a nice phrase about you don't want to be left behind like flotsam on the beach. I'm left behind by the rising tide of empire. Some very beautiful speech, but you get the point. So when he couched his independence project is couched in narrow economic terms. So all the broader questions, and I have a little more in my notes, I'm not going to go into them. All the broader questions like the social transformation of the society, education, and so forth. These were not, I'm not saying that these were not important to him. Don't get me wrong. I know I plan to make Guru tonight, but I'm not saying it in those terms. But I'm saying that it is the capacity to do it. He claims were not there. And of course, that encapsulates for me what I want. So I've just basically said what I wanted to say about the difference between colonialism and post-colonialism. And I went into some detail about how St. Lucia couched its post-colonial environment. And now I want to come to the second part, which is to explain what I think framed the debates in the various political parties. And I think I've said enough to hint to you what those debates were. So the so-called more radical groups began to make a case for a wider interpretation of the possibilities of St. Lucia. Okay? So if you remember the early debates, then in 1980, debates about Hess Oil. So Hess Oil has a terminal in cul-de-sac, and the radical groups are now saying no, but there was not enough demanded from Hess Oil in terms of the charge for throughput and the return to St. Lucia. Compton, again, with his limited economic approach, is just concerned about employment and having a Hess Oil provide jobs. And the more radicals are demanding more. one of the interesting things I want to show you is that it's actually very stark. Think of something like schools. You know, maybe I can be corrected in tonight's meeting. But one of the things I actually discovered in looking at closely at secondary schools in St. Lucia, do you know that there was hardly the use of consolidated funds by the government of St. Lucia under Sir John to build secondary schools in St. Lucia? So you had, again, Roman Catholic Church, St. Mary's College, and St. Joseph's Convent. Seventh-day Adventist Church, the Seventh-day Academy. George Charles and the SLP built the Viewfort Secondary School. In fact, George Charles said that he wanted to build a secondary school for the children in the South. Leon Hess Comprehensive, after the hurricane, built by, again, the same Leon Hess I just mentioned. The Castries Comprehensive Secondary School, built by the father of the present Prime Minister of Canada. That's why it had the little symbol of built by the Canadians, and so on and so forth. Very much later, you will begin to see, again, I'm going to come to that. So in other words, something like post-colonialism and education, fundamental things. These were not placed at the center. When I was doing my PhD research, I had the pleasure of interviewing Osbert, because Osbert was a fundamental planner at the time. And Osbert told me, well, you know, Tennyson, Sir John was very much aware of those social things, but he was waiting to do it a little later. And that struck me, because even more recently, and I'll come to that, we heard talk of, I'm going to do I want to get the economic fundamentals right first before we can do some of the things that we plan to do. And that is what I mean when I say the key differences between the political parties. So there was, in fact, an ideological difference. I want to show you how the SLP under George Odlum and Josie had a different conception of what independence. I'm quoting from the Hansard, because I have that. That is the independence debate. You see that book, that little independence debate there? That is very, very important to me. That is where you get the philosophy of the two parties during the independence debate. And this is Josie speaking. You see, Mr. Speaker, St. Lucians are always going to be second-class citizens in St. Lucia. The reason for this, Mr. Speaker, is because at one time in St. Lucia, we had a ruling class that was represented directly in St. Lucia by the kith and kin of those colonial masters who colonized them. Everywhere you went in key positions in the service, you had a white man. On the plantations, you had a white boss. He was representing his white master overseas and was keeping us in subjugation, keeping us quiet for him. All that has happened when this government took power, he's referring to Sir John's government, that before independence, is that you substituted the local master for the expatriate. You know, Mr. Speaker, what they call a concubine. You know, Josie was a very troublesome person. You know, Mr. Speaker, what they call a concubine. This government is a local concubine of the white expatriate exploiter. I like the radical turn of phrase of this, the local concubine of the white colonial exploiter. That is what it is. This is what they are doing, performing the same role of exploiting our people as the foreigner did. So I can't give it to you any more stark than that. A difference in ideological opinion as to what a post-colonial state can do and what a post-colonial state should do and cannot do. And I have a little quote from him. He goes directly. Can we in St. Lucia today say that if this government ever gets constitutional or political independence, that we will at the same time evolve automatically into economic independence and cultural liberation? Can we say that? So he puts cultural liberation on the agenda, and he puts economic independence on the agenda. I can go further, but I will stop there in terms of explaining to you, just setting up for you the differences in terms of ideological outlook on the possibilities of what a post-colonial state can and cannot do. Okay? So I now want to turn to the meat of our question, which is going to the political history of St. Lucia and showing us, looking at this thing called social transformation. Remember, my main thesis is that this the essence of a post-colonial state is its extent to which it engages in social transformation. And why am I saying that is the essence? Because it is the opposite of what the post-colonial state did. So I'm not inventing that. I'm telling you, if a colonial state could not do that or did not do that, and intellect and philosophically could not do that, then a post-colonial state had to have been doing that. And I also want to make the point, I know I'm simplifying, but there are many more complex things about a colonial state and a post-colonial state. But I'm trying to give it the essence for the purpose of the talk we are tonight. So if we take the first period, 1979 to 1990, what I call the banana period. Now, you know, the banana economy is the focus of the thing. And let me show you how the two parties had their issue on bananas. Again, linked to what we just read from Josie. So Sir John's argument, in fact, somebody, I remember talking to Rasuku informally. And Rasuku said, Sir John used to say, all your talk of black power, look at the bananas, that is my black power. And to a certain extent, the other point, because you would say, well, look, you have a farm, you have a group of farmers who are their own bosses, they have their land, and they have a ready market. That's a progressive thing. In addition, we often forget that the SLBGA was a rather very progressive, what today we would call a cooperative, a progressive cooperative. Of course, it had its own class divisions and so forth. But by and large, you can understand how the politics of St. Lucia is defined around that. But it was narrowly economic because it was based on the same Geest and English conglomerate owning the rights to all of the produce. You had no alternative markets, and you had something called, you were basically price takers. And what I've just described there is the language that the radicals use to criticize Geest. So you can see again the split. But more than that, I want to propose that the banana economy militated against social transformation. So one of my arguments, I know I said we wanted St. Lucia, it didn't go down too well. I made the point that look at what happened to the banana revenue. So did the farmers, the people who were growing the bananas, and you know those regions, Miku, Denry, Babuno, was there any radical transformation in the lives of the banana farmers? In fact, the Yankee report shows you a very dismal story of environmental damage, health damage, but more so I've argued, where was the bank? Where was the farmers' credit union? And they were the ones bringing in all the revenue into the country. And still there were no schools, there was no investment in social transformation and so forth. So the banana economy 1979 to 1990 was, again, when you read, and I've read many of Compton's budget speeches, the same thing. Of course, I want to make a simple point. 1979 was the year of independence, and 1979 was a year of global radicalism. So in a sense, the SLP, Odlum and Josie and that group began to, at the very moment of independence, and we can understand that logically, began to place some very radical things on the agenda. Perhaps they went too far, but also, let us not forget, that the global environment was one. So you had, I can list them for you, the Iranian Revolution, the national liberation movements taking place in Africa, the Grenada Revolution, the Cuban Revolution was consolidating itself. There was, in fact, an alternative. There was a non-aligned movement. Again, I can go into all of that. But what happened, that also made Sir John even less inclined. Because, of course, again, he made, in that same independence speech I told you about, he made this comment about I will not be wasting my time on the barren wasteland of ideology. What he was trying to say is, I'm focusing on economic questions, and this talk about the national liberation and so forth, that has no place. So essentially, 1979 to 1990, you had this very limited, and again, I'm open to being challenged to it. And when I say limited, I mean, where were the radical investment in healthcare? Where was the radical investment in sports? Where was the radical investment in schools and education? And there was this straitjacket in terms of what the possibilities of St. Lucia's independence could mean, because again, of that dichotomy between socioeconomic growth and stability and social transformation. And of course, I know it's a wide period, but globalization 1990. Essentially, the banana economy collapsed on what we call globalization. That is the point I make in my book on St. Lucia. So let's think about it. Europe 1990, the loss of trade liberalization, the special preferences for markets, the special preferences for our bananas reaching European markets, the formation of the European Union, all of those things, the rise of the WTO. So since 1990, you had what was then known as the rise of globalization. And once globalization took place, the special arrangements which St. Lucia had with bananas collapsed. So the St. Lucian banana economy collapsed on the basis of an economic global phenomenon called globalization. And with the economic collapse came political transformation. So John was retiring, and you had this long problem with the Banana Salvation Committee, and the very baby that had given rise to the Compton phenomena was what led to the collapse. And of course, 1997, the SLP comes into office. So the SLP comes into office now on a, let's call it a reformed SLP. But with one key difference, the global banana, in fact, one of the mandates, or I guess unspoken, one of the tasks performed by the Anthony administration was the transitioning of St. Lucia out of bananas. You all remember the history well. He was dealing with the issue of the privatization of the bananas and so forth, until basically that whole banana political economy came to an end. But we have the question of social transformation. And that is what I think makes my point about contending ideologies on what social transformation can mean. So let us go through. Universal second. So all of these things which Sir John had been hesitant about in relation to social transformation. Not banana economy, but there was an articulation of a policy of developing St. Lucia and St. Lucians, bringing them into the modern world. I'm not sure, perhaps, maybe later history might tell us about that. I'm not sure if Kenny Anthony's exposure to Barbados had given him a model, because I like to contrast St. Lucia to Barbados. 1966, 1964, Compton is premier. Chief minister rather. 1966, Evan Barrow is prime minister. He has independence. So 64, 66, there's no big difference in that. And among the first things that Barbados does is a rapid policy of social transformation. When I ask people, tell me the difference between Barbados and St. Lucia, there is no, in terms of size and resources, compared to Barbados and St. Lucia. The only difference is a heavy investment in the social sphere. So Barrow immediately free university education at the newly formed University of the West Indies, free health care, subsidized transportation for elderly people, pension funds. All of what we now today call social democracy is what is implemented. So I want to suggest, I'm not sure if I have any firm argument to make it. He never told me so, but I think there was, in fact, he came into office with this social agenda. And just to go through, universal secondary education, the construction of secondary schools, the one in Marigot, John Odlum and others, the broaching of universal health care. And I say broaching because it had never got the chance to be fully completed, but it was on the agenda. The modernization of health facilities, the investment in the new mental hospital, the new Owen King Hospital, the construction of the Socio cricket ground, the construction of the George Odlum National Stadium, the full integration of St. Lucia into what I call the West Indies cricket culture and fraternity, okay? Universal access, a policy of universal access in terms of basic things, water, light. So when I was attached at the time, the policy of universal access was basically you give Light and Power $1 million a year, not Light and Power, sorry, with Barbados. You give Lucia $1 million a year or whatever the amount was, and put poles near people's houses. And the same thing with lime and so forth. You had to have a policy of universal access. No longer was it that people in Choiseul and in the rural communities don't have. If Castries has it, make it universal. Of course, I'm forgetting the big thing, which is an economic one, which is the liberalization of telecommunications. So under Compton again, the limited thing, lime, but it was cable and wires at the time, but no attempt to, and of course, let us not ignore the global environment. So you have this thing called trade liberalization. The same trade liberalization dog that bit the banana industry was the same trade liberalization whip that you were using to now transform the telecommunication. And let's also not forget that you have what I would call structural shifts, because no longer is the world built on agriculture and raw materials. You now had telecommunications and the world of the internet, and therefore the so-called knowledge economy. So those were the factors that see immediately you have social transformation, because you now have an articulation of some of the things that the post-colonial state could and could not do. And they were doing it, in a sense, a demonstrated capacity of doing it. But you also had the vulnerability to the external shocks. So that my second period, as I told you, is 1990 to 2008. During that period, you had the bombing of New York, the 911 thing, of course. Just to give a stark example, Kenny Anthony's investment in the so-called Rochemel thing. It was the 911 that exposed the Rochemel, because when the hotel I was built was supposed to have paid back, then 911 meant you had. So in other words, folks, there were external economic factors limiting, or at least that brought that project to an end. If you want to, I'm putting it in very broad terms. Okay, so in a sense, in terms of the economic side, period meant was you had a shift out of bananas into tourism and services. So that was a broad economic shift. That is when you now begin money from financial services, and you now began to place greater emphasis on tourism. That was the new shift. But of course, that also made you vulnerable to external shock. But you get my sense when I said that there was in fact something called social transformation. I'm looking at my notes to see if I forgot anything, but you would know, we all live through this period, so you would know for yourself. But of course, we come to the final period. So the final period now, 2008 to the present, 2023. This is a period of global economic crisis. And in fact, massive global economic uncertainty. And I want to propose to you that global economic uncertainty is reflected in the political uncertainty in St. Lucia, the one-term phenomenon. It is the fact that, of course, you must take into consideration the death of some old, long-standing generals who have thrown the politics asunder. But the truth remains, that period is such an uncertain period in terms of what the global environment allows, that it has also reflected itself in political uncertainty, but also bearing in mind you have two firm political parties. But what of economic transformation? So 2008 is the period of, I'm giving a very rough thing, the Kenny Anthony administration to 2020, the Compton King administration, again, a rearticulation of the same limited possibilities, limited possibilities of social transformation, focusing on the same economic things. But the Kenny period, the last Kenny period, it was a clear articulate, the phrase I gave you just now about getting the economic fundamentals right. That was the phrase. So anybody can tell me this. I just listed for you a whole set of things that were done in the 1997 to 2006 period. What were the things done in the 2011 to 2016 period? There were very few. And again, because the language used was because they were overwhelmed by the economic reality. And of course, it was reflected, as I said, in the political situation. And of course, the rise of Allen. So Allen now represents pure neoliberalism, liberalism in its essence. So any of the things which even Compton was, because of his social democratic tradition, was able to focus on some basic little human development things. The Shasta administration is neoliberalism writ large. So concessions to hotels, concessions to foreigners, of course, the DSH thing. And of course, any remnants of social transformation, any remnants of an emphasis on the social were there as hangovers from the previous period from 1997. So the uncompleted projects, like the St. Jude and so forth, the Owen King Hospital. Socio was there already. The fire in St. Jude, that was hospital can't come up. The stadium that you had. So what of sports? What of education? Oh, classic example, education. Do you know that Antigua got the latest campus of the University of the West Indies? The Side Islands campus? You think Antigua was ahead of St. Lucia in terms of infrastructure, population, educated individuals? That Antigua would have gotten its business right because Antigua is focusing on the social. They are aware of the need to bring Antigua more firmly into getting access to education for its citizens. And that's an example of what I mean. So those things are de-emphasized. The South Sudanese Community College, it's in a mess. The A-level college is in a mess, and nobody is talking about investing in the A-level college. That's where you get your cream of the crop, your future software engineers and so forth. So the social has been de-emphasized, and I'm saying to you, it has been de-emphasized largely on the consequence of that overwhelming inability to craft a response to the global economic challenges. I witnessed Barbados, and I will end in a while, Dave. About 5 more minutes. I will end on Barbados. I'll give an example of Barbados. I witnessed the debate about the free education thing under the last DLP administration. I sat through that. I'm not Barbadian, but I put my mouth in the business. I was writing all the time. And I was questioning, why are you letting Barrow's legacy go to dust? And the arguments were, you can't afford, we can't afford to pay for students. Again, the same neoliberal argument. And lo and behold, me and Molly came into office, and the same things that we were told could not be done, the first thing she did is give students free education. Okay? Because I couldn't understand how you have this fundamental, transformative institution, if you want to call it that, and then you were playing neoliberal games with that because you falling for the old talk about the global environment. You were actually destroying Barrow's legacy, and that's why the DLP can't win another election. And that's why in St. Lucia, you have this vacillation between the two parties since 2008. So I want to conclude now what is to be done. I have given you, what in my view is a broad discussion. I hope I've done enough. But I want to give you a discussion. Oh, another example I was giving about the Shasta period. The non-participation in the FIFA World Cup. Okay? Something as fundamental as the youth playing their football and have, even if we couldn't qualify in CONCACAF for football. But give the fellow the chance to play their football now. Somebody will get picked on a somebody will discount it or something. So all of those things is examples of decay insofar as this thing called the fundamental, the social. And now we have the issue of crime. The issue of crime in relation to what we all confront now with Lucia, with the gun violence. And of course, I forgot to mention the challenge of COVID. And COVID was important because COVID placed the issue of human development at the center. In fact, COVID, I speak on a Marxist now, unapologetically, COVID was proof that you had to invest in human beings, otherwise capitalism would collapse. But the COVID period is a clear example of, which we take into my last discussion about what is to be done, of how you marry social transformation with economic fundamentals. Now, folks, when we build a bridge or a highway or an airport, we do so on the basis that we're building infrastructure so that we can make money. So if you build an airport, if you improve your terminal, tourists will come into the country. When you build a bridge and a highway, a port, you improve the infrastructure to make economic activity possible. Why it is that we cannot understand that you invest in human capital? If you give education to your citizens, this is tantamount to you building a bridge. And in the new economy, the so-called new knowledge economy, you invest in human capital, and that human capital brings in revenue. You talk about the creative industries. In other words, music, sport, dance, fashion. You invest in human capital, and then that brings in the revenue. So no longer is wealth to be made in a banana field wealth is now to be made in the very human beings that we in St. Lucia, we have clear and incontrovertible evidence that that is our main resource. We have produced 2 Nobel laureates. We produce musicians and dancers and artists. Now, how many Rihannas does St. Lucia need? Only one Rihanna. One Rihanna is worth more than 10 DSHs. What about investment in software engineering? Those things, so I'm making my point. In terms of this contradiction between economic development and social transformation, you resolve the contradiction by making your investment in social capital the basis for your economic development. Okay? So a post-colonial state in the 21st century can have many other things on its agenda. Some of them I didn't go into, but at the center of it is that because of the transformation of the world into the so-called rise of knowledge economy and in terms of the possibilities from creative industries, you place your emphasis there. A foreign service, our consulates, the same way in the old days you're looking for investment, for foreign investment, you can now spend your energies, in my view, trying to find ways in which you can tap into this world of that new area of human development that you can now use as a basis for transforming your society. And that is my humble take on the question. I would now pause there and open to some debate and some discussion and some feedback. I thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Joseph. So we will now open up the floor to questions. I will ask that we keep the questions as precise as possible to the topic. And just the floor is open, and let's begin. I do have a question from Mr. Julian Dubois, the ambassador, and his question is, can you explain the evolution of the relationship that Martinique shares with France?
Yeah. So I saw the Martinique question come up in the chat while I was talking. Now there are different colonial systems. So the difference between the British colonial system and the French colonial system, the British colonial system contained an element of a local elected assembly. So built into the British system was the possibility that one day the local element would have what is called self-government. The French system is based on a simulation in which the more progress you make, the more French you become. So you become France outre-mer. And so there is no room for our anti-colonial projects developed differently. Jukes, when I was doing my research on St. Lucia, I came across a lot of work by, let's say, a woman called Helen M. Hingens. And she was writing a theory called Alternatives to Independence. So she was arguing no longer, and it's a thing I hear very often among the French, even in our own Caribbean case, the BVI and the Turks and Caicos, they still make those arguments. We gain so much more from being in the French, as remaining colonies, that it's not worth. We are better off. Now, when they say that you were very off-headed, contrasting it to Haiti. So Haiti is the best one. I say, oh look, Haiti got its independence. So the short answer to your joke is that there were different colonial systems, and those colonial systems led to a different kind of assumption of what post-colonial possibilities were. In the English-speaking Caribbean, there was always an understanding that your post-colonial possibilities resided in you gaining your own sovereign apparatus and making those decisions. In the French case, it was an opposite. By the way, I'm not sure if we were all following I think it was around 1980, the early 2000s, the upheavals in Martinique and Guadeloupe. So those upheavals over the price, they were over the price of goods. The same 2008 financial crisis led to a set of mass revolts in Martinique and Guadeloupe. And those mass revolts can be likened to the mass revolts that we went through in the Caribbean in the 1930s. Of course, the final story has not yet been told, but we can see, never assume that the question of sovereignty is closed, because there will be moments when a non-sovereign people find themselves so hurt by the colonial relationship that we don't know what their actions might be. So let's say, for example, a deeper economic crisis in France. We don't know. But the point is, that's the best I can tell you in relation to why Martinique and Guadeloupe, why the French colonies have not gone the independence route and why we have.
Thank you for that. Dane Quinn James had his hand up, and there are two questions in the Q&A to the bottom of your screen.
Let's see if we can find those.
I can see two questions there.
I can't.
Can I read them?
Yeah.
So some mentioned Antigua, there's the current bureaucratic infrastructure in St. Lucia support or frustrate establishing an environment which would accelerate socio-economic change based on global shifts. Okay, so right. So in other words, you're asking about there's no difference between the bureaucratic infrastructure in St. Lucia and the bureaucratic infrastructure in Antigua. What I would say to you is that now that the question of what you're raising there now is the question of the public service. And again, I didn't mention anything about the public service in my discussion about the post-colonial state and the colonial state. But the public service is a critical distinction between the two. In fact, one of my old lecturers always used to tell me that the word public service only becomes relevant in a post-colonial situation. So there was no public service during the colonial bureaucratic institutions were not meant to serve a public. They were meant to serve the colonial state. Now, so that's why we still have remnants of things like swearing oaths and oaths of secrecy, because the post-colonial state, during the colonial state, if you were a clerk working in 1940, working in the St. Lucia civil service, you were serving the British colonial government, and therefore you had to show more loyalty to the British colonial government than you would to the local government. Now, one of the debates about our post-colonial bureaucracy is that we should do away with many of the archaic bureaucratic structures. Because those archaic bureaucratic structures do not align with a free and independent people. Those archaic bureaucratic structures align with our own colonial environment, and reasonably so. But something like information, when you put let's say you make a request for concessions, there's no reason why that should be shrouded in mystery, because you're now an independent citizen of Antigua or an independent citizen of St. Lucia, and you're now expecting your state to act on your behalf. So all of those, very interesting question. I would say to you, the bureaucratic overhang. I understand a civil service is concerned with things like efficiency, anti-corruption, but we should still make the point that very often many of the rules the civil service were colonial overhangs. Our court system too is an example of the colonial overhang. And we now need to, when we speak of constitutional reform, I think that Daniel will be dealing with later on in the series. These are the kind of questions we should be asking. I don't think when we speak of constitutional reform, we start by asking the wrong questions. The right question should be, what should a post-colonial constitutional framework look like? What are the things you need to overcome to make possible greater freedoms, greater economic participation, and so on and so forth? So my answer to you, my friend, is that the bureaucratic system in Antigua and St. Lucia are the same. As we say in our Creole, mem bet, mem well. And I have no reason to believe that there's a difference between St. Lucia and Antigua, because we both inherited the same colonial institutions.
Okay, I have a hand raised by Raphael Sandhill. So I'm going to allow him in to ask a question.
Hi, good night. Good night, all, and thanks, Tennyson, for this lecture.
Thank you, comrade.
You educated me in terms of reminding us of what Sir John was saying at his Parties Convention for Independence. And he pointed out that he wanted us to go for tourism. You know, reflection, 79, 44 years on, you know, that is what the present government are now talking. They're pushing tourism. Same now, progressive ministers of government are putting tourism, the tourist dollar, above social transformation. I don't know if you're aware of that. As you speak, I said I was happy last night. I listened to Kenny Anthony's interview for 25 years of independence. And he gave credit to Sir John, both in Creole and Patois. And that was touched me. And then tonight I'm listening to you. Do you know, Tennyson, that George Odlum, the radical George Odlum, actually wrote in his Crusader newspaper that he has never been a member of a socialist party. But there's one man who was, I don't know if you know that in the studies, John Compton was a member of the Society. Right? So John Compton was more socialist. He joined the Fabian Society, and Odlum was proud to say he's never been a socialist. So therefore, I don't want to get involved in that, but they see that we have to look at pre-independence. From the guys who went to England to study, the Barrows and Compton and Forbes Burnham and those guys. Then when they left England, they came back to the islands. What did they do? Compared to the post-independence persons, the University of West Indies graduates, what did they do? And I must say, as I listen to you, right? Because you know John Compton was against bananas. The 1996 banana strikes in the valley was a fight against bananas in favor of sugarcane. Yet he was transformed to manage that banana economy as he saw it happen. But I want to add in the conversation that it's high time that, you know, we start looking in terms of policy, because I look at the constitution of both political parties and I don't see much difference in them. As a matter of fact, the Labour Party has bread, freedom and justice. But if you follow the United West Party, they talk about forming a middle class, right? Yeah. That is what they are actually promoting what you're talking about, the local bourgeoisie. So United West Party has that there, right? Yes. So although in my search though that I'm asking myself, we as black people, you know, the people that we had our Kudme mentality, our mindset. I remember Jordan spouting about the Kudme, etc. What has happened to that? We have moved away from that. And I think for Post and Musha, we need to have the Kudme mindset back. People helping people. And then what we are doing, Tennyson, and I want that in the conversation, is that we have project managers. We have so many consultants. I remember, John, when I was at university, we asked people to talk about John in education. We had the largest contingent of non-campus students in St. Augustine and Jamaica, anywhere else. John Compton paid, we had so many trained, as you call it, agronomists. Every year that guy's going to UE to do agronomy, EKIAP and JC. I don't know what happened to them. That is what I want to discuss. Because Compton is actually educating those guys. And I must conclude by saying that I have to remember my friend Ufina Paul was a planner in agriculture who said that Compton's lament that when she goes to a meeting, instead of the agronomist advising him to what to do, they wanted advice from him, a farmer. Right? And I do not see much difference, because what I'm seeing now in a post 44 years after independence, instead I'm seeing those guys with their masters and PhDs in the civil service, the public service, who are assertive and managing and getting things done. I seen persons who are now subservient to politicians, politicians who are about their own political pockets, right? Instead of national interest. I do not know how we're going to resolve that. And I'm asking you, what are your prescriptions for that? Thank you, comrade.
Well, comrade, you said so much that I don't know what to say. Except to tell you, I agree with the first part, the point you raised about the LSE. Remember, these guys a lot of these guys who at LSE, the London School of Economics, was actually C.D. and Beatrice Webb, Social Democrat, the Fabian socialists, who formed it. So the WFL, that was where he first started. And there was a man called Harold Lasky. In fact, when Compton first came back, his enemies were calling him communist because of the influence of Harold Lasky. So people like all of I think the two, Manley, Sir John, Barrow, Arthur Lewis himself was there as doing his first person thought. So there was a Fabian. In fact, the Caribbean post-colonial project was Fabian socialist. The idea of intervening and so forth. Now, I appreciate the point you made about Sir John and his policies. You gave me a little more nuanced discussion. But the point I was making is, remember I said there's a broad. I was giving you broad contours, and there were. That doesn't mean he was not concerned about social transformation. But I think the point you made about the bananas, for example, in my researches, he's actually talking to Geist when he was Minister of Trade under the ministerial system. Sir John Charles had responsibility for labor, and Sir John had ministry for trade and production. And there's a meeting, I have it in my files, a meeting with Geist Industries. It's in the British Colonial Office, where he's actually I'm encouraging Geist, giving Geist comfort that no, we will not. And then Geist begins to articulate a very pro-Compton policy, because Compton was the radical at the time. And so there are a lot of things we need to go into, Brother Hill. But the broad, I take the broad point that you raised. I will disagree with you though on the what I would call the reductionist arguments about UE. And so I mean, I'm not defending UE, but the kind of reductionist to say you know you wouldn't do this and you wouldn't do that. It's an easy target. I always respond by saying the university is not a monolithic institution. The university is not a monolithic institution. A university is a broad church. You have all types in there. So when I will say, you with this or you with that, I ask them, which UE? So first of all, UE is not a radical institution by stretch. So very often we say, oh, the UE radicals. That's not true at all. So if you look at any of the, like let's say, let's go back to the so-called radical days. You can count them on one hand. So it's not like there are hundreds of lecturers, but you know 3 who are in the news. So let us not bring it down to, oh, you didn't do this and you didn't do that. The point is, we are challenged now, and that's why I agree with you, in terms of identifying critical and innovative ways of using our intellect and our policy-making capacity to devise creative ways of resolving those, both the economic and the social development challenges that we face. And that's why I was trying to propose some of those things in the end. Although my proposals are neither exhaustive nor in any way fully refined, that's where I think our energies have to go. Because the global economic crisis will continue. There's no end in sight. But we cannot rely on this argument. Oh, your tourism argument? I agree with you. So remember I said to you, the shift took place. The shift from tourism, from agriculture to tourism and services took place under Kenny Anthony. But there are limits to what a tourism-based product can do. We know all of the arguments against tourism, how it siphons wealth. It is based on expatriate capital. Locals have no role to participate except in terms of, so we know the problems. That's why I was making a case for other things, other areas of development that place empowerment in our hands and not just building a hotel in front. Let me give an example, Raphael. So Airbnb, for example. So there's technology called Airbnb that can make ordinary solutions participate in the tourism industry. So we have what a Marxist would call shifts in the economic infrastructure that make new possibilities close at hand. And so it's not just a question of saying, we know what the challenges of tourism are, but we can now develop a local bourgeoisie or a way in which we can have local participation. So these are things that our creative policymakers need to put their minds to, because that's how you have the social transformation. But we, at the center of it being, we put in solutions, and we are making the point that when you transform that little boy, when you give him software engineering skills, that little boy can now develop a new app and bring in revenue to the country. When you teach the children music and guitar, you can have a Rihanna, you can have, I'm full of talent. That is one thing I can tell you about Caribbean populations. We have a comparative advantage in our artistic capacity. There is no running away from it. So let's invest in that a little more and move away from this traditional development thing.
Tennyson, one final question. You know, as you're speaking there, right, I want to ask you, have you ever thought of, you and your colleagues thinking of cooperative republics, not like for what Forbes tried, because the Basque region in Spain is really a cooperative area, bigger than St. Lucia. You know, the Madrigal experiment is like very successful. For example, like we're talking about, and we go to Israel, the kibbutz, village tourism. The kibbutz are run by students. When I went there the last time, was students running the kibbutz. So why can't we have in that village tourism a concept of cooperatives? And I must add, and you must add to your research, the last paper we had on a policy on cooperatives was in 1974, when James D. Busque was the Minister of Community Development and Cooperatives. And he had a policy on cooperatives, Tennyson. They started going to teach cooperative schools. Yes. So James D. Busque, right? In 1974, the policy on cooperatives, we have stopped all those things. And therefore, because the economic cake is so small, it's much smaller now than before, right? We need people to come together. That is what I think we need. That to think that one Rihanna, yes, will help St. Lucia. But if we could make, instead of one Rihanna, to have like Dubois supposed to be a cooperative man, have 10,000 Lufa Francois and Booze, right? I prefer that to one Rihanna. That we could start thinking, molding our people into working together. That could be mentality.
Yeah. And you know the study that needs to be done too, Raphael, the study of the SSBGA. Man, I think the more I study it, you actually had a cooperative system in place there. And actually, but the other point I want to remind you though, remember there's this thing called neoliberalism. So when you say JMD had this study on cooperatives, dominant orthodoxy now is not on cooperative modes of economic organization. So the neoliberals, if you want to blame the new generation of students now, the neoliberal economists, this whole Washington consensus and private sector-led growth, that's where the problem starts. So again, I keep making the point about the kind of ways in which we start to think for ourselves. And so I remember talking to Alex Jordan, he was telling me about he gave me a very interesting idea about passion fruit. He said when you go to Spain and the man have his vineyards producing his wine, he said passion fruit. Imagine everybody in St. Lucia have a little passion fruit going in the little backyard, and you have wine. You can actually have ferment that into wine. So these are the kind of things. I agree with you. Cooperative systems are alternatives to individualistic, neoliberal, private capitalist modes. But we have not been taught to think in those counter-hegemonic ways. And that's why our economists can't think of those things, and our state planners can't think of those things. I'm not attacking them, I'm just telling you their training and what they're exposed to and what they're told the world can and cannot allow has limits them. But you with your historical knowledge, which I think is what we all need, you can go back and show how a historical knowledge of those things can inform our actions in the present.
Okay, I'm going to, in the interest of fairness, take a question. I'm going to go back and forth. We have hands up and we have lots of questions coming in. So I have a question from John Jack. Thanks for mentioning Antigua. Does the current bureaucratic infrastructure in St. Lucia support or frustrate establishing an environment which would accelerate socioeconomic change based on current global shifts? And recommendations, if any. And
then I think I had answered that as the first one. Remember when I read the questions from the thing?
You did.
Answered John Jack's question. So the next,
okay. That was my mistake. I'm sorry about that. Sure. I have a question then from Anselm G. Was the colony better equipped to handle crime and corruption?
Anselm, but remember the colony was made to control populations. So what we call crime and corruption, what we call crime and corruption today is not how a colony would have seen it. A colony would have seen it as bandits and people who are challenging the state authority. And so it's not a fair question. All I would tell you is that the colonial state is in fact, so to give an example, the warships used to come into the harbor. So when there was a little disturbance, the warship would come into the harbor. I'm not comfortable answering you as to whether or not the colonial state is better equipped Because I'm trying to tell you there are two different conditions. The first condition is a state that is acting on behalf of British oppressive forces. And the second one is a post-colonial one that is dealing with our population. So when we speak of crime and corruption now, it's a different rationale. We now want to protect our citizens from criminals, and we want to protect our systems from malpractice and so forth. So it's not a fair question answer. And that's the best I can tell you. It's like comparing chalk and cheese.
Okay. Thank you, Dr. Joseph. I have a question from Tanya Alfos. Tanya? Tanya?
Yes, good night. Can you hear me?
We can hear you.
Yes,
okay. Okay, thank you. My contribution, well, is going to be very brief. First, I'd like to say I was very moved by the presentation that Dr. Tennyson Joseph gave. It was very interesting to hear a little bit about the state in the colonial times. However, my concern now, I'm a teacher, and my concern is about the youth. And I like the word, this is why I joined this webinar, because the social transformation part of it grabbed me in. So I joined in. I'm very concerned about our youth in St. Lucia now, simply because we have the youth. When you look at the prison population, we have a large number of our youth in prison. When you look at the schools, a large number of the schools, we have issues with the discipline of the students, their behavior. A lot of them, when you look closely, you see they have criminal tendencies and stuff like that. And it is all because of the households they grow up in. Now, this is what we call a social issue. And Dr. Tennyson Joseph, I remember you teaching me Politics 1 and Politics 2 before you went away to do your master's at the time. That was in 1997, I believe. And I remember we had some debates on those. But it's a social issue. That means it affects a large sector, a large part of the society. It's long-standing, and all of that makes it a social issue. And of course, now it becomes I would think, it becomes the responsibility now of the government to find some form of solution to that. And because of that, I am one who thinks that we should, at least with all the great social scientists we have, you, Dr. Tennyson Joseph being one of them, we should have persons coming together to sit and plan, I believe, the way forward for some kind of social restructuring to address these matters. I am not too well versed in social transformation, but I can pinpoint a lot of things that from my limited view, I can pinpoint a lot of things that's affecting it. For example, employment. When we look at a large number of the kids at our school, their parents are employed by the hotels. And that contributes to lack of supervision because the parents spend a very long time at the hotels. I know of a particular case where a parent, they go in, there's the morning shift, and then they're given 1 hour to go back to return for the night shift. Now, when you have a parent working like that, what time does that parent have to supervise his or her child? Okay. Then there's the other part of it, economic. We do not have what you call the minimum wage or minimum. Beg your pardon?
No, sorry. I said wages. Wages.
We don't have that. And this is something I experience a lot at the schools. It is very difficult to teach children who are hungry. They're not focused. Their primary goal is not to listen to you. They don't want to hear anything about mathematics or IT. When I teach, they're hungry. They need to be fed. And you find, how am I going to say it? I don't want to say anything but we need to look at that because the wages, we need to have a minimum wage where that people can survive off of it. Some parents make a salary where they only have just enough money to pay their bus, their transportation fees to go to and from work for the month. This is the reality of the situation. Another thing, again, that's contributing to, well, from my perspective, we have the police. And I'm going to be brave to speak on that. The police does not respond to a lot of cases involving a crime where the kids are involved. For example, I teach at a particular school, and sometimes you have fights and stuff breaking out right there in front of the police station, and they do nothing about it. You call them, they do not respond. It's like there is no, it's like our whole society, to me, we need to do something about it to bring it back to where I think it was when I was a little girl. It was a much pleasant place to live in St. Lucia. You could leave your door open and you could go anywhere. You could go to the market, return, and everything would be fine. And it's not like that anymore. So I personally, from my limited view, I think that we need to do some real restructuring. And the thing is, we could talk all the economics. We could put all the economic structures in place. We could go out there, get it and put it there. But who are we putting it there for? Dr. Tennyson, Joseph, you said something very important. We need to invest in our people. And one thing I see right now, we need to save the youth. Something has to be done to save them, and somebody has to speak up about it. Okay. One more thing I want to touch on. I like that I like that the new government is talking about the youth economy. And you said that well, you noticed that we have a lot of brilliant musicians, and I too, I am aware of that. I know a lot of them, the young ones, especially when the Venezuelan embassy had this collab with the St. Lucia School of Music. We had the St. Lucia National Music Orchestra. And that was so beautiful to hear and to sit down and listen to them. And I am very happy that the jazz is coming back on stream. But given the fact that we want to create this avenue for our youth to take advantage of everything, I have not really, apart from the St. Lucia School of Music taking advantage of the jazz, this jazz time, there are some kids, there's the young ones out there who are not in collaboration with the St. Lucia School of Music. And they do have their jazz bands. They have performed at other places, but I have not seen them on a lineup, so to speak, for jazz performances. And I'm just curious about that.
Yeah. Right. So you said a lot to us, but I'll just say two things to you, Tanya. So I like your last example because I wanted to be prescriptive. So the thing is the music. So imagine a policy in which every school, primary school and infant school has music on the curriculum, and every child can learn to play a musical instrument by the age of, or at least be exposed to a musical instrument. Foreign language is the same thing. So these are not hard to do. These are just employing enough people with the right skills in the education system, zoning the country. So that would be my answer to you in relation to not just creating Rihanna. I didn't want to make the point about Rihanna. I'm making the point that we now have to invest, because the young boy in Monguji Sozel, we do not know if he might be the best guitarist in the world, but he's never held one in his life, or basic music theory and those things. So we can do that as a kind of, let us review our curriculum to do those things. And the same thing can go to other skills too, like drama and dance. Now, the question you raised about when you began about the crime. So, Tanya, the question now is, remember I was talking broad social policy, but there is lower level social policy in relation to social work and counseling and psychology. Now, these are the kind of things you need investment into. So that is also part of social transformation. Okay, so what you did was give us a very beautiful description, a horrendous one, of what causes societal problems. So the overworked parents, the low wages. But another level, you need governmental intervention to deal with. But these things normally cost money, and it normally cost money in terms of training people as well. But I'm making the point that we cannot keep playing this. We cannot keep widening this false dichotomy between cost, economic cost, and social transformation. But you said a lot more, but I don't really want to go into all of it. I appreciate your comments, but the two things I want to leave you, I want to respond to essentially is an elaboration on the policy. How do we move this thing into a broad policy which we expose our young people to all kinds of things around which they can develop their social skills and make livings out of it, make a living out of it. And it's no longer a case where, I'm sure many of us are young parents now. Our parents didn't want us to learn to play football or because they wanted us to go to school. But all of us in this room know now we know better than that now. We can see on TV who making all the money and so forth. It is the footballers and the cricketers and so forth. So we're not reinventing the wheel here. We're saying let us now invest because that's what we have. And the other point is the point about the crime and so forth. That is a call for certain levels of social intervention in terms of social workers, social care, psychologists, and counselors, which we have not been spending a lot of attention to, again, because we are de-emphasizing the social. We put them in jail. We deal with them at the end point. The police and the prison, we build the Socio, we build the bordelais, but we are not dealing with it at the other point, which is to prevent them from becoming criminals. So that's my response to you.
Thank you, Tanya, for that contribution. Unfortunately, all good things must come to an end. We have reached our time. Now I see Daryl has a question. Daryl, will you make that short and sweet?
I didn't write it, so it could have been read.
We have a number of questions in there. Unfortunately, we weren't able to get to all of them. Maybe the consulate can consider starting a little earlier or something so that we can accommodate as many questions and as many people as possible, because it looks like Independence Dialogue Tuesdays is becoming quite popular. So you want to go ahead, Daryl, or should we?
How has the politics changed since 79? I mean, I put the question based on the early observations of you and Inch regarding the similarities in the parties' constitutions, and even the fact that they perhaps different sides of the same coin in terms of the emphasis on social stability, social emphasis versus economic stability. Even the different sides of the same coin. How do you think it has shaped the way the politics has been conducted, or how has the politics since 1990?
Okay, so Daryl, sorry, because you're going in and out, but I read your question. And I heard some of I heard the gist of what you were asking. How has the question about the similarity between the two parties and how has politics changed? Again, I want to just I know we ran out of time. Our chair, Dean, has put us on notice. I want to give a quick response to you. Remember the broad global radical agenda collapsed in it collapsed in let's just say 1990, but the beginning of the collapse was that long decade. In fact, we had our first collapse in the Caribbean with the Digital Revolution, and after that, the possibilities for radical agenda were all downhill. So our politics became centrist. And then you had broader emphasis on the neoliberal thing, the Washington Consensus. So our politics became centrist. So then the similarities, the differences have narrowed because they're all dealing with, so if anything, the more radical parties are now mildly social democratic, and the conservative ones are still very much into the economic fundamentals which I was talking about. I would warn though, and I have to do it in this forum, we saw the emergence of a brand of neoliberalism that we had never seen in St. Lucian politics before, since John Compton and right through. And that brand of neoliberalism was not unexpected because of the global shift to neoliberalism. It was unexpected to me. I didn't expect to see it taking root in St. Lucia the way it did, to the point of having political success. But that's an error of my own naive politics. But the fact of the matter is, it cannot be ignored, Daryl, in explaining because remember, you had the Trump phenomenon. the Trump phenomenon globally is an example of that neoliberal thing, where a businessman comes into office and all of the arguments are the same, that basically you need the so-called career politicians are a waste of time, and you need a businessman because his success as a business makes him qualified for political leadership. It's the first time since Plato that was ever said. If you read Plato, Plato actually says the opposite. Businessmen and producers do not govern. Now, the Trump phenomenon is what I think, the shift to a pure neoliberal type has emerged. But I honestly do not think it hits Lucia so hard that will maybe be naive again. I don't think we will see a continuation of it. But my knowledge of history tells me it's like a volcanic eruption. If it happens once, if Vesuvius explodes once, Vesuvius can explode again. If you have a 7.8 magnitude earthquake in the year 1880, then you got 7.8 magnitude in the year 1325. So the fact that it has happened is a new political reality that we need to bear in mind. I would also say, Daryl, about the political parties, all of them have moved to this image-making thing. So what my friend, the brother who was talking about cooperatives and things, was trying to explain. There was a particular kind of politician. He never wanted money. The person who was doing the house to house for him didn't want money. What we have now, we have marketers. So you bring in the so-called Barbadian electoral gurus, and they're just marketing people, and so that's what the politics has become. And we now let's focus on content and policy and real. We're now dealing with let's win the election and do all the razzmatazz. And both political parties have taken. That is why, by the way, you can have certain neoliberal types emerging. Because I can market you. and have a speech writer for you, even if you can't make a speech yourself. And that, I think, is what is happening in our politics, which I think is in line with what I call global neoliberalism and the shift to individualism and postmodernism and those things. This is impacting on our politics in various ways. And that's what I think, Daryl, is my best answer to you in relation to how the politics has changed and how the parties have become more and more similar and so on and so forth. But I continue to rail against it because that's the most I can do.
Okay, Dr. Joseph, I've just been given the green light to go until 10. Are you okay with that, or is that?
I'm okay. I've enjoyed this. I've enjoyed this dialogue.
Okay, excellent.
I've enjoyed this.
I will take a question from the. Awesome. I will take a question from the attendees, and this one is from a Dr. Alvin Abraham. What is your perception of the failure of the West Indies Federation, I guess, or he says federal, in affecting progressive social development, especially in the OECS?
I think remember I was saying, Doctor, that the question of post-colonial options are very complex. I mean, we for our purposes tonight reduced it to social transformation. But the thing is very complex. One of the features of the post-colonial thing is how you enlarge your sovereignty. So that was a debate at the time when we were going into independence, whether you have viable states or whether you're too small. And one of the ways in which they overcame this problem of the viability of the sovereignty was to engage in the federation. And once the federation collapsed, we were left on our own. That's why we end up in this, to use a Barbadian Obanafa phrase, a porricky independence. But if I had the time, Doctor, I would have had some discussion about, when I was giving my prescriptions in the end, on my paper, I had Guyana's oil, and I had the federation. So we cannot now, so all of what we were discussing just now, Dr. Abraham, we were discussing them within the context of a narrow St. Lucia experience. But the narrow St. Lucia experience is not the beginning and end of our sovereign possibilities. Our sovereign possibilities can be widened in the first instance to the OECS, which I think we have some real capacity for in relation to our historical ties, what we already have on the agenda, which we often don't celebrate enough, the free movement of people and so forth. But I do not think in other words, I make that point in Barbados all the time. We have exhausted the possibilities of our single territory independence. That's a fact. in other words, everything you can, of course, St. Lucia still has some room to go. But if you take a country like Barbados, everything that Barbados can possibly do in terms of the only thing that they're not talking about building offshore islands. That's where it has gotten, like in Dubai and those places. But in other words, we now have to move the thing because we cannot, the OECS is a natural place by which you expand that sovereignty. Now, I have Guyana on my little list here because I just came from Guyana last week, and my friends, there's a revolution taking place in Guyana over the oil. So Guyana's economy grew by 60-something%. It was the fastest growing economy in the world. And they have massive revenue from oil. And Guyana is now, trust me when I say that, you can quote me on that, in 10 years, Guyana will be the center of Caribbean development. Their plan is to move into manufacturing and it's a massive plan. The last budget was being read when I was there. Now, I do not see how we in the Caribbean facing our economic challenges cannot begin. I wrote my article for the weekly paper, which is due on Thursday, and I was making the point, but CARICOM has not yet articulated a space for itself in this Guyana revolution taking place there. So to answer your question, brother, we cannot run away from the fact that there is a point at which the individual possibilities of a small island state to transform itself meaningfully is going to be reached. We had the historical example of the Federation, which will never disappear as one of our possibilities. And we also have the concrete reality of our OECS, which is a stepping stone into the future. So I definitely think, again, our foreign policy experts who are in the room, part of our intellectual energies. If I wasn't an academic, I'd be quite frank with you. These are things I have in draft. If I wasn't an academic, I would be writing a manifest, what I would call the integration manifesto. I have it in draft, but nobody will take this seriously. The integration manifesto, in which you now begin to make it a grassroots social movement. The one thing missing in all of our attempts at federation is that we've never had a social movement at the grassroots level for Caribbean unification. We've had social movements in everything. We have social movements in religion, in church. Rastafari is a social movement, everything. Marijuana legalization, homosexual rights, all of those things. We have social movements in those things. We don't have a social movement. I can't think of one that exists as the Caribbean social movement for integration. And I think if I were not living this life, and I were living the life of a public activist, that would be on my agenda. But I certainly think we have to, as policymakers and so forth, begin to put that on the agenda, because our limited small island sovereignty, there's a limit to what we can do with it. And it certainly will come back on the agenda, especially since the global economic crisis is going to continue.
Hey, thank you, Dr. Joseph. And I have a question from Cohen James. So I'm going to open up the floor to Cohen. Cohen?
Hi, how are you? Good night to all. I hope I'm audible and clear.
Hear you, loud and clear.
Okay, thanks. So I'm listening. I'll start off with the question. The colonial state and the post-colonial state. Dr. Tennyson, where would you say we are in terms of the transition from that state? Have we transitioned, or are we still transitioning? And if so, if we are still transitioning, how far do we have to go in terms of time or in terms of circumstances and conditions? Because I'm listening. Well, I mean, I have more, but I don't know if you want to take it now and then I continue, or you want me to just go ahead.
Let me take this one first. So very good question. So it's never an end point, but I will give you some examples of where we are. So let's take something like, I know Damien is going to talk about constitutional reform. So let's take something as basic as, and that one is symbolic, but it's basic, it's important. Something like the monarchy. That's an example of an unfinished political agenda. So you can actually put a pin and say, well, we got independence in 79, we kept the Queen as our head of state. Barbados took the step of getting rid of it. So in terms, you can actually point to a generation and say, put that on your agenda. And I think St. Lucia has, but of course, again, typical of St. Lucia, you're hearing a mention of it, but never a follow-up action. Another example was your judicial authority, the CCJ, same thing. So I can point to you, Gwen, about these. Now notice what I'm doing is not giving you economic examples. I'm giving you constitutional examples. These are easier to do. The economic ones are more complex. There's never an end point to that. Because, for example, let's say, for example, imperialism always moves. The point is, you can develop a situation in which you are aware of what the colonial condition is, and you are actively looking. So let's say, for example, the point that Brother Sentinel raised in response to my question, the development of a local entrepreneurial class. So we had that post-independence, but then you heard something like, you forget what neoliberalism did? Let me give you an example. So we had something called Aliens Landholding Licenses and Aliens Landholding Acts. That's an example of a post-colonial strategy. That means, well, our country is small, so we're going to put limits to the extent to which aliens can own land. That's a reasonable post-colonial strategy. Then you have neoliberalism, and it says, well, no. You cannot put restrictions on foreign capital, and therefore you should ease up those alien landholding policies because it is preventing you from. So what I'm saying to you, Gwen, the struggle is eternal. It never stops.
Because well, now that you're responding, it sounds like we have a long way to go, because you did mention, I want to call it the culture. How much of the colonial culture has been brought in? So if we say, for example, the police force, some people say it shouldn't be called police force, it should be called police service. And you mentioned when the warships came into the harbor, what it came to do, and you just mentioned some of the legal, the constitutional stuff. Even our parliamentary system, is it patterned from back there, stuff like that. And based on, and on the economic side too, I mean, while listening to the discussion, I was thinking to myself, okay, post-independence or post-colonial, we are into bananas. And then, like you said, tourism was a plan from Sir John way back then. And the SLP government had the task of really doing that transformation when the banana really got in trouble. But I'm seeing in the colonial setting, you were there to serve the colonial masters. I forgot the term that you used. But the bananas is still feeding the colonial masters. The tourism is, in a sense, entertaining and providing relaxation for the colonial masters. And then, I mean, I'm happy you brought up the point after, because when you were speaking about it, I was thinking to myself that one of the few ways that we could really, really get out of it is via population explosion, because then you have enough to kind of service yourself, so to speak. And then you brought up the point about the federation and CARICOM and stuff like that. So I was thinking, yes, but in a sense, we're still there. And then you brought up the arts as well, which I have always thought, because I had a little bit of involvement in the music, and they tell you, for an artist to stand out, you have to have something unique about yourself. And I've always said that one of the issues with St. Lucian artists and why we are not getting out there is because we are trying to do what is out there. We need to do our own. And the Denry segment is an example of that. The Denry segment, they sing our culture. They sing what we would say. And that is new and refreshing to the air outside there. And it has proven that they have gotten places. Obviously, I think it still needs some refining and some development. But back to your thing, we have to use what is ours. And then you spoke about there was something you spoke about teaching in all schools. But I think it has come to a point where Creole should be taught in all schools. I know I was told at some point there was a drive to do it at SAFA, but I think it should be in all schools now, because it is one of the things that makes us unique. It is one of the things that gives us our culture, gives us culture. And living here in the United States, I see it among among us, yes, that our, that culture has kind of been taken away. So we're trying to adopt a culture here, and we're in a state of confusion a little bit. And I'm not just talking about like somebody like me who came here recently. I'm talking about, from way back when. And so, and that's the other thing about this country. It's so culturally rich in that diverse, and people stick and stand with the culture. And if you have no culture, where are you? You have to try to find yourself somewhere.
You know what you have just done? You know what you have just done first, Gwen? Yeah. You've done a balance sheet. That's why I tell you it's a very complex question. So you did a very excellent balance sheet of things to do, things not to do, what can be done, but excellent. So that's why I tell you it continues all the time. So, and I like the examples about music. So it's remember this thing is a very complex thing. Like we could go into religion and a whole set of things, culture. So if you want to undo that, you cannot even know, you don't know where to start. But the point I'm making is, and what I saw coming from you, is a consciousness of it. So once you are conscious of it, then you have different, that's what the areas of emphasis. There might be somebody into, remember what I read from Josie? There might be somebody who's into culture who might be telling you, you need to transform so and so and so and so into culture. There's somebody who might be into economy, might be telling you, you need local manufacturing. So the thing is a real complex web of things. But the fact is, we are a small island development state. We are moving incrementally in a context that we move from colonialism to post-colonialism, but then we face continual challenges. And as you rightfully said, we're now looking inward and outward to see how we can respond. But you did a very good balance sheet of the pros and cons, what to do. And I know, I didn't want you to don't feel what I say about it either. You see, there's a tendency you can feel, it's so overwhelming, you can end up feeling defeated. But just remember, hold your little space. If your space is a cultural space, you get your energy from that. My space is a political academic space. I get my energy from that. And other people have other spaces they get their energy from. But we're fighting a battle together.
Thank you, Kerwin, for that contribution and for the question. I'm going to take one question from John Mangal. And he's asking, moving forward, in light of the external threats by the war in Ukraine on our food security, how do you think we should approach this with so much emphasis on tourism at the expense of our food security? Keep in mind Ghana's approach to cut exports to Switzerland and produce their own chocolate, have resigned ourselves to primary production and not add value to what we produce.
Very good. So again, the question of food security, but the Frafra is an example of another question that my friend Gwen didn't even mention. So food sovereignty and food security is another important feature of a post-colonial state. I said to you, it's a very complex thing. So Ralph Gonsalves in his book on Caribbean civilization, he makes a point about a staple grain. And I think I like that point. He says, Frafra, that every civilization has a grain. So in some places it's rice, it is wheat, it is, in our case, in our own Caribbean, we had our grain, we had in the pre-Columbian period, we had maize, manioc, and we had cassava. Now, there are two views of food sovereignty. One view is, and I like the one with the staple grain, one view of food sovereignty is you have something that the community, in the worst case scenario, the community can eat. In other words, you can eat that for the next 50 years, but you're eating that thing. Okay, like some people it's rice. I know rice is starch only. But so our policy planners should start by thinking of, because in terms of war, the Second World War in the Caribbean, and Barbadians always boast about that. That was the one time when Barbados was self-sufficient in food was during the Second World War, when the boats were requisitioned for use in naval battles. We in St. Lucia and any Caribbean country should start there. Let us look at what a basic staple is that we know in times of war, in times of famine, in times of hurricane. Everybody in St. Lucia have that. That's one way of thinking of food security. There's another bourgeois version of food security, which is I remember an economist friend of mine talking about saying, well, food security is having on your plate all the basic nutrients that you need. Now, that was a little, I call it the bourgeois version. In other words, don't come with this one grain thing, right? If you need protein, you need, but Safa, you're correct. So the war in Ukraine, another feature of that sovereign question is this question of food security. And I do not think that we in the Caribbean are as challenged on that front as we're making ourselves out to be. That is one fish. You all know I'm from Chosen, right? So they say, what is it? Potato, just peas, potato, and poisson, right? There's a fourth P, which I will not mention here. but once you have those, you're good. And we can, something like self-sufficiency in chicken and egg production. We can start there. The same way I said, have a system where you teach children music in schools. You can start from a policy where there are certain foods that we can have self-sufficiency in that we just don't have to. We don't have to import it at all. And we don't focus on those things, our agricultural policy and so on. And we can do that. And that is how I understand Frafra food security, not only in the context of a war in Ukraine, but as a permanent feature, as Rav Gonzav says, of a civilization. Every civilization should have its grain. And you're starting from there. What is your grain that you have that you know you're going to survive on, come what may?
Thank you. I'm going to take one more question from the attendees, and it's going to come from Jeremiah Norbert. I'm going to open the floor to Jeremiah. Jeremiah?
Good night, Dr. Joseph.
Hi, Jerry.
Yeah. Let me first commend you for a wonderful session. I happened to join even before the session started, so I found the moderators and I caught them whispering before we actually started, just to show you that I had a keen interest in listening. And I'm very happy with the discussion and the cause that this discussion took tonight. However, I don't know. My thinking is that we look at, I know we spoke about, you mentioned colonialism and you mentioned the post-colonial period, and you said, I mean, during the colonial period, they were trying to achieve, well, they were only focused on two things. I don't know if my mind allows me to see right now the era that we're in. I know we consider it post-colonialism, whether we're seeing past these two things or whether we're still in the same, or maybe a more neo-colonial type of era. Because when we look at tourism compared to the times of the plantation economy, we still see quite a few similar traits within the two of them in terms of who the owners are, who the workers are, how the profits are repatriated, and whatnot. And I ask myself, looking at where we are now in 2023, and in terms of achieving the socio-economic transformation that we want to achieve, do we have, as a small island developing state, do you think that we have real capacity? I mean, let's just be honest, because I think you call Frafra, John Mangal said, we look at the external factors. We say when the metropoles cough or when they sneeze, we catch the cold here in the Caribbean. And they say, I heard a lot of talk about investing in our people. But a lot of our investing depends on I mean, we come under the hard and fast rule, or we come, you have places like the IMF and the CDP, you go to them. It's not like you're self-sustainable. You go to these agencies for funding. This funding comes with certain rules and prerequisites. There are some things that you have to do. You have to abide by some things, which does not give you the ability to be able to use the monies or invest it in the way that you want. So yes, we may want certain things. Yes, we may want, I agree that we should invest in our people. I agree with that 100%. And I share that same sentiment. But do you really have the ability as a small island developing state? And that's why I like the idea of the federation. And I think that the federation can set out to achieve a lot more than when we go and negotiate. Because one of the things I take serious issue with is that even in the Caribbean region, you look at the way that we negotiate. To me, it really bothers me, especially as a young individual. When we negotiate, or when you hear certain prime ministers when they have conversations, it's like St. Lucia does not negotiate on the fact that, boy, we have two beautiful pitons and we sell ourselves as, we want investors to come. It's like we have to give investors or give in to what investors are asking, because if you don't do it, Gaston Brown will do that in Antigua. And he's going to give them what you're not giving them. Or Ralph will do it across there. And so either you give in or you lose an opportunity. So I don't know I want to know your honest opinion. Do you believe that we have the ability to really accomplish that type of socioeconomic transformation that we're looking for as small island developing states?
All right. And Jerry, I'm always honest. I always try to be honest, so I'll give you an honest answer. But just listen to you. Before I do, I forgot to mention something in relation to Quen. Quen was talking, I wanted to make another point that I think was important. When he was trying to wait, it might help you clarify my answer to you, Jerry. When he was asking about, the kind of frustration about whether you decolonize or not, I wanted to make the point that sometimes it's not A or B. So let's just go back to the banana question. So there were several factors, Quen, about the bananas, which point and suggest neocolonialism. But I also made the point that in there, you had certain things which were positive in terms of your ownership of your own land. I'm sure Jeremiah from you would appreciate what I'm saying there. In other words, when you move from tourism to bananas, you lost certain things too, because you lost that idea of my own plot of ground, I'm a producer and so forth. There were other elements in the thing. So let's not think of it as a hard and fast A or B, black or white. Inside the thing, you have nuances that you can work with. Now, to Jeremiah, a good question about neocolonialism. And that's why he was trying to say to Quen, it's an ongoing battle. I always try to be optimistic. What's his name? Gramsci. Gramsci always said, I maintain an optimism of the will, despite the pessimism of the intellect. So over time, look at us. Look at us over time. How our children speak. See how knowledgeable they are. And over time, there has been that transformation in our societies. Of course, bearing in mind what Tanya was pointing to, the other side, our lost generations of young people and so forth, which we must pay attention to. But I can see evolution over generations, our grandfather's time to our time. And you can also do the balance sheet gains and losses. So the question about neocolonialism, I think, is important. So when you raise about the IMF, I was asking the question, the example I was giving was, for example, with the aliens land holding licenses. And I was saying there is, in fact, a reality in which some of the things which the post-colonial state was able to do, it is now being told it is no longer able to do on the basis of economic limitations, debt problems, balance of payments problems, and going to the IMF. These are facts. These are facts. The double whammy, you invest in infrastructure and social development, and you take loans for that, and then you pay a price in terms of going to the IMF, who then limit you. But I do not think, Jerry, that the answer is to assume lack of capacity, because there are ways in which creative economists have dealt with those matters. And I also think that, as I was trying to conclude, the two things are not mutually incompatible. The two are not mutually incompatible. So there's a way in which the IMF, for example, focuses on, it would downplay direct investment in social services for its own reason, but at the same time, you can invest in human capital. You can use the World Bank and so forth to invest in human capital. So I think there are ways in which we can do it. Also, the question of the regional options. There are also new ways in terms of climate change and so forth, in which you can make money. Guyana is another good example of what they're doing with the carbon neutral policy, being paid by Norway and by Hess for preserving the forest. There are ways in which, the same way I was making the point about the creative industries, there are ways in which we can look at what the new global environment is and tap into ways in which we can bring finance into our country that can free us from some of the strictures of the IMF. So don't take the blanket thing about IMF, and even the IMF itself has transformed. So we're now hearing about more kind of notions about development with a human face and so forth. So it's not the thing is struggle. there are ways in which states and the communities can struggle. Once you know what the struggle is, Barbados is a good example of what Mia Motley is doing on the global stage. Again, I'm raising questions about creative foreign policy, the way you position yourself globally. There are ways in which you can fight those things, which I don't think would allow us to reach a blanket conclusion to say that in this current era, we cannot do those things because the IMF says. I gave you the example of the administration that did it in the era of the global economic crisis. In the era of the global economic crisis, post-2000 and you had some of the most remarkable advances in Caribbean in St. Lucian social development. The most ever in the history of the post-colonial history of St. Lucia. So don't tell me you can't do it. You can do it with political will.
Thank you, Dr. Joseph, and thank you, Jeremiah, for asking that question. So this really is our closing. Again, all good things must come to an end. Thank you immensely, Dr. Joseph. Your presence here tonight was very, very, very much appreciated. You can tell from the responses, from the questions being asked, that this topic has quite a bit of relevance on the hearts and minds of St. Lucians. So we appreciate you coming in here tonight and enlightening us on the topic, and for just, giving us your perspective on and answering all these questions. So thank you again. Thank you kindly. And while I'm in the process of thanking, I want to thank the folks over at the Consulate, especially Ambassador Dubois. Thank you, sir, for accommodating Independence Dialogue Tuesdays. I want to thank the folks over at GIS, Joshua Venor. Thank you very much, sir, for keeping us alive and streaming in all platforms and for just making this possible. Really appreciate you. I really like it when a good plan comes together. I would also like to thank again all the folks over. Oh boy, I had a whole list. I'm starting to sound like the Academy Awards now. So yes, all the folks over at Diaspora Affairs and the various missions and consulates, thank you very much for your participation. I want to announce next week's Independence Day topic will actually be on Wednesday, because next week Tuesday is Valentine's Day, so we're going to have it on Wednesday, and the topic is going to be the role of culture in the struggle for independence. So we're going to have presenter Raisa Joseph, the Executive Director of the Folk Research Center, and we're hoping to include Monsignor Anthony on that panel as well. So again, I want to say thank you, folks at GIS. Thank you very much for extending the time. We know it's late over there in St. Lucia. So thank you very much. And for all the participants, thank you for the questions. My apologies for not being able to get to each and every question. Hopefully we can extend these talks and have these talks a little bit more often, because they are relevant to what's going on in our society, in our economy, in our nation. So let's get all those points of views out there and let's continue to talk. So again, I want to say thank you. Look out for us next Wednesday when we talk about the role of culture post-independence. And I would like to say good night, farewell, and thank you very much again.
Good night and God bless. Thank you.
Good night. Good night all.
Yeah, good night, Dean. Very good,
Good night.
Moderation.
Thank you,
Thanks.
sir.
All right.
All right, you take care.
We're ending now. Thank you. Have a pleasant night.
All righty.